So my thesis was about slave narratives. Slave narratives are narratives of a person's life in slavery during the written and published during the 1700s, late 1700s, the 1800s in the U.S. And I'm looking primarily at a U.S. American context. The thing about slave narratives is that there's about over 2,000 published written slave narratives. However, the thing about them is that they're all very similar. They all start with a beginning of, I was born, this is my life in slavery, now I'm learning to read and write, and now I really want to leave and escape to the north, and now I'm a free person, and this is my life now as a free person reflecting on slavery. So in this way, slave narratives are primarily abolitionist texts. However, the thing I find very important about them is that their dedication to go north and to escape slavery starts with learning how to read and write. Now, learning how to read and write in the U.S. slavery institution was completely forbidden to enslaved people, because if they learned how to read and write, then they could possibly write their own pass and travel and escape up to the north, which is what pretty much all these slave narratives did. But the thing is, this kind of falls alongside with the literacy hypothesis. Now, the literacy hypothesis is this generally accepted idea that when a culture learns how to read and write, their culture evolves just in general from away from storytelling up into something more rich and intellectual. Now, this literacy hypothesis is very imperialistic in nature, because there's a lot of cultures, primarily in South America and Africa, in which oral storytelling traditions are like the main storytelling traditions, and they are not lesser cultures because of that. However, learning how to read and write for African Americans was an emancipatory act, because it literally led them to freedom. But at the same time, by writing into this literacy hypothesis, it's also an entrapping act. And so I wanted to look at how slave narratives permeate throughout Black American literature and see how Black authors kind of grapple with this literary tradition, because slave narratives are the literary tradition to Black American writers. And so I do that by looking primarily at Richard Wright and his 1945 autobiography, Black Boy, and then I also look at Octavia Butler's 1979 science fiction novel, Kindred. And the thing that I'm looking for primarily is this kind of theory of double consciousness. Double consciousness is this theory theorized by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1905, in which he says that Black Americans are constantly under this double consciousness, where they have to view themselves from two different selves, as an American, as a Negro, from the outside in and from the inside out. And so they're constantly battling these two different selves and trying to reconcile them, but they can't. And so I argue that slave narratives, being this like emancipatory act and entrapping act of writing, is completely emulates this theory of double consciousness. And so, as I was saying, I was looking in Black Boy and Kindred to see how do these authors grapple with this literary tradition and write their own double consciousness and kind of deal with that past that's very tragic, but also very, there's something just very enlightening about coming into contact with that. But ultimately, I argue that both these authors challenge the slave narratives, Black Boy through writing a memoir and then completely changing the style and form, and Kindred being a science fiction novel and copying slave narratives, but ultimately to tell you that we cannot depend on these slave narratives to learn all we can about slavery. And the reality is the written word can only say so much, and there's a lot that's missing behind that, in itself refuting the literacy hypothesis and also contributing to this double consciousness literary form.